disciplines like sociology or any other discipline of knowledge grows in institutions. It doesn't grow in isolation, grows in groups, grows in departments, and departments have their own history, their own traditions, and around those traditions evolves a kind of group of scholars which then produce some seminal texts, and around those texts the discipline grows. And then you have a kind of community of scholars which in a sense talks to each other, may not think alike, but then they do have some kind of shared agenda of doing research. Center for the Study of Social System, which is JNU's Department of Sociology, has a history of around 40 years. And during these 40 years, some very important scholars have been part of this center, and it continues to be a very active place where sociology is taught and researched. It has nearly 20 faculty members now. A lot of work is being done here. Dipankar Gupta was in this center for a long time, and then he left. He kind of took voluntary retirement, and we wanted to kind of claim that legacy. Lots of other scholars who followed him in the kind of work he was doing, we needed to kind of take stock of it, what kind of work he has done. And it is also a way of bringing together past and the present. And so I thought that, bringing out a volume which would show not only the scholarship of Dipankar Gupta, but also the number of people from different parts of the world who have worked with Dipankar Gupta, who kind of identify with his work and through his work with the Center for the Study of Social System and the kind of sociology that we are trying to do and trying to kind of bring together through scholarships of different scholars spread across the country and the world. So that was the idea. So I thought, maybe one should kind of start writing to people. We prepared a long list. I had discussion with some other colleagues inside JNU and outside JNU who were also in a sense friends of Dipankar Gupta and wanted to kind of make sure that Dipankar's contribution to sociology is consolidated and recognized. And then gradually a list evolved, and then we wrote to different people. I wrote to various people, and then they many of them responded very positively. And we also had to kind of work around the broad areas in which Dipankar has had interest and his general interest. That's why the book is called Interrogating India's Modernity, and that has been in a sense obsession or preoccupation with Dipankar Gupta. He is a very kind of a committed scholar, but also very passionate citizen. So he participates in scholarship from a position which in a sense is future oriented, which tries to think about Indian society in a particular way. So I think that was the challenge, to kind of make sure that the standard of scholarship is at least as good as Dipankar's own scholarship, and it also in a sense celebrates and consolidates the effort made by Professor Gupta himself. I think Professor Dipankar Gupta occupies a very interesting place in Indian sociology and the wider what one calls as Indian social sciences, because Dipankar Gupta is somebody who is born after India's independence from the colonial rule, and he's grown in independent India. He's not somebody who belongs to the Nehruvian generation or the first generation of social scientists. Most of the discussion on Indian sociology or Indian social sciences has been around the founding fathers and a few mothers who kind of brought perspectives on sociology from the West, who were trained either in Oxford or in US, and then they came to India and started working here. Somebody introduced structural functionalism, somebody worked with Marxist framework, somebody worked with systems analysis. So Dipankar Gupta was not only born in India, but also he studied here. For example, by that time the universities in India had come up. For example, he studied in Jawaharlal Nehru University and Delhi University. So by the time he was student, India had already become a kind of viable nation which could teach people who could become scholars of first rank in the world. So Dipankar had studied in India, and also in 70s, 60s and 70s. Those were also very important kind of decades in Indian history. So his vision of India is not colored by the Western traditions to study Indian society. So social sociology in India, for example, was very closely linked to social anthropology. And social anthropology as a discipline had evolved during the colonial period, when the Westerners wanted to understand or study India or the other countries which were outside the developed world of the West. Sociology was a discipline which was seen as study of the self, and their self meant the Western urban societies. So Dipankar grew up in India, and Indian sociology people used to study either the village or the tribe or joint family, something which was seen as part of the traditional society, not something which was modern. By that time we were also talking about modernization, 60s and 70s, and Indian cities had always been there in India, but somehow in social science traditions, in social anthropology, India was identified with the village, which was actually historically not true. And Dipankar breaks away from this tradition. I think that's the most significant thing about Dipankar Gupta. He doesn't do his PhD by studying a village or a tribal community or joint family. He goes to Bombay and he studies Shiv Sena. And Shiv Sena itself was a very interesting kind of process at that time. And he looks at Shiv Sena not as an aberration, not as like historians would look at processes like that as communalism, but he looks at it as social movement, as something which is open-ended. You could actually study it either way. So he does not go to study Shiv Sena with a kind of prejudgment. He goes and looks at its structure, its mobilization processes, its ideology, its cadre. So it's a kind of new sociology that begins with Dipankar Gupta's work, which is study of contemporary, which is study of transformation, which is study of urban society, and from the perspective of social movements, not like you study city as static categories. So I think that was very important. And then he moves on. It's not like he is studying only city or social movements. Inequalities are very, very important aspect of our society. Question of caste is something which has remained a very important subject in Indian society, and many people were writing about caste in the 70s, early 70s, for example. Liu Dumo's writing on caste became very popular and very powerful, very influential. They were very problematic. Lots of people felt uncomfortable with Louis Dumo, but very few people had the courage to actually go and confront Louis Dumo by looking at his assumptions, by looking at the literature and the alternative sources that were available to sociologists. Dipankar Gupta does that. He looks at the historical literature, he looks at empirical literature, and he confronts Dumo and shows how wrong Dumo is. He is not talking about India, he is actually trying to just develop a theory, because that theory would in a sense reinforce a Western notion of India or an Orientalist notion of India, and this is written primarily for the Western audience, and this is something which has become popular. So his work on caste is actually quite significant, and he in a sense opens up many new areas, and he tries to argue about caste in a very different way. And his contribution to critiquing Dumo have in a sense played a very important role in the way we think about caste today. He himself studies inequalities, also caste in Gujarat and in some other parts of India, and writes about that. I think the most popular book that I have argued in this volume is his Oxford University Press edited reader called Social Stratification. This is basically a collection of essays on caste. So when he was working on caste, he came across large volume of literature on caste, and he selected the best readings which were required for a student to understand caste. I think that has become a very valuable resource for the students and teachers of sociology and some other social sciences who want to get a good idea about caste without getting lost in libraries on manuscripts and journals where literature on caste has been published. So it's a very interesting kind of compilation of writings on caste, which has actually been a major contribution of Dipankar Gupta. From the study of caste, then Dipankar Gupta moves on to study of rural and agrarian change. As I told you earlier, he is not somebody who went to a village to study to do his PhD, but rural India is important because 70% at that time, perhaps 75%, India lived in rural areas, and agriculture also was very important. So what was happening to agrarian social life? And in the 80s, you had the rise of powerful farmers movements, in northwest India, close to Delhi. We saw farmers' movements in UP, in Punjab, in Haryana, in Gujarat, in other parts of India. So what were these? So Gupta goes to these areas to study farmers' movements from the perspective of social movements, and then he kind of looks at this whole process of mobilization, the way old peasants turn themselves into farmers, and they are kind of looking for better deal with the urban trader. They ask for subsidies or fertilizers. So what is the nature of these farmers movement, and how does one understand what modernizing influence or effect they have, or they actually producing tradition? Can we use categories like civil society in contexts where people are organizing on caste lines, because farmers movements were mobilizing themselves on caste lines, invoking institutions like khap panchayats, etc. 1980s also saw the rise of strong ethnic movements in India. Khalistan movement in Punjab, for example. In Northeast, we had strong ethnic movements in Assam. Rise of Hindutva movements in different parts of India, particularly around the question of Babri Masjid. So these are again issues around which Dipankar Gupta kind of develops his own scholarship. So the 1980s were also the time when India witnesses other identity movements. You have the rise of Khalistan movement in Punjab, you have very strong ethnic movement in Northeast India, Assam crisis as it was called. Then you also have the rise of Hindutva politics in different parts of the country, particularly in UP around the question of Babri Mosque and other issues. So Dipankar Gupta responds to these processes and develops his own scholarship. I mean, his book on Punjab, Context of Ethnicity, which was published by Oxford University Press, was perhaps the first full-length study of Punjab crisis of the 80s. And he comes out not only with kind of descriptive account of what Khalistan movement was and how ethnic mobilizations were done in India, but he also proposes an alternative, proposes a solution, how state needs to be neutral and how these ethnic conflicts need to be approached by the state, and when is the time when situation goes out of hand, and what are the things that state should never do, what are the things that society should never do if they want to develop into modern democratic states and societies. So I think that was a very, very important contribution. And then this is something which continues with Dipankar, and then he again goes to Gujarat in the 21st century, the first decade of 21st century, and looks at the Muslim question, looks at the riots in Gujarat and how communities have to reconcile, and they are willing to do that, but there has to be some kind of justice. So there has to be justice before reconciliation. So what you find in Dipankar Gupta's scholarship all through, he talks empirically, but he also talks normatively. He talks as a social scientist, but he also speaks as a citizen. So his scholarship is in a sense committed to some kind of vision of India, which is in a sense normative vision, where he talks about modern democracies. Modern democracy is not something which is simply a technical thing. It is a moral and political question for him. So you have to build this kind of society, and you can do this. As sociologists, we need to understand where do the fault lines lie, and we need to identify them. But they are fault lines, so there are possibilities to kind of fill them up and develop a society which would, in a sense, make us citizens of a modern society where there would be, in a sense, more cohesion and possibility of providing equal opportunity to everyone, a modern liberal society. That's what I think Dipankar's vision is.